What are the we don't talk about these things history or country? I live in Japan for 3 years and have some Japanese friends. Every time I asked them about WW2, they mostly did not know the atrocities that Japan did in WW2. They knew Japan was in the wrong side. But it seems the details were lost. It seems like there is a national effort to forget this history because it was shameful. Edit 1. A lot of you mentioned about the Unit 731. I read it and it was awful beyond any reasonable standard human being. All of those horrible things happened to the civilians and POWs were unfortunate, and I couldn't imagine how bad their sufferings before dying. I was pretty much disgusted knowing that the inner circles of the Unit 731 got pardoned by the US and lived their lives until old age for giving the US the result of their horrible experimentations. This thing should not have happened. Those people in charge must got the justice that they deserved for allowing and facilitating those kinds of horrible experimentations to other human beings. I feel like a lot more people should know that one of the world's biggest mass murderers in history was a Belgian. King Leopold II basically controlled the entirety of Congo all by himself. And while doing so he extracted the nation's natural resources and killed 13 million people. All for his own personal gain. That kinda score gets him up there with Mao, Hitler and Stalin, but he is rarely mentioned. New Zealand very nearly had legal eugenics. In 1928 a bill nearly passed Parliament that forced sterilisation for the mentally defective, and the Ministry of Education was required by law to give names of defective children to the Ministry of Health. A separate part of the law said that such people weren't allowed to get married. The opposition lobbied for these sections to be cut out. Not because eugenics was immoral and insane, but because there was no evidence that it changed the gene pool in any way. Brazil destroyed Paraguay, killing almost every man and a lot of its women and children. It was a proper massacre. India. Death of Lal Bahadur Shastri, former PM of India. Involvement of KGB and people who were actually not alive at that time. Forced sterilization of 6.2 million Indian men in a single year 1976. There you go. You can also watch the Tashkent Files if you want to know more. I wish we could say Italy doesn't talk about the bald man who was besties with Hitler for a while, but sadly we got an immense amount of nostalgic idiots who carry his face on clothing and gadgets because war criminals are so very cool apparently. People in Sweden get really uncomfortable when you point out that we, as a country, were really into eugenics. The Race Biological Institution was founded in 1922. Supported by every political party and the king at the time. It existed until 1958 and, as you might expect, did some really fucked up things. Romanian Holocaust. Romanian people deny that we had mass murders during WW2. That Jewish and Gypsy were killed and that we send a lot of them in concentration camp. Like Auschwitz. Here in South Africa the true native people, the Khoikhoi, are the most politically and economically disadvantaged people and no one gives a shit. Not locally. Not internationally. When the remains of Saartjie Baartman, a Khoikhoi woman, read her story. It's pretty awful. Were returned to South Africa, not only were Khoikhoi people not invited to her burial, they were actively kept out. Maori people enslaved and ate other Maori. It is well documented, yet completely ignored when discussing our history. All people have done shitty things to other people throughout history. We should acknowledge it, learn from it, and move on. The Sami people. They have been forced to change their way of life. And have been subjected to abuses, violations and racism. Sweden, Norway and Finland have been criticized internationally for policies against their indigenous populations historically and their lack of action and recognition of the Sami people's rights today. We don't talk about La Guerra Cristera in Mexico. They don't teach it on school or talk about it on TV and media. The martial rule KMT placed on Taiwan when they escaped from China. This led to a period called White Terror, where hundreds of innocent people and bright college students were killed for not joining the party, including some who many thought could go on to win Nobel Prizes and do groundbreaking research. The expulsion and ethnic cleansing of 14 million Germans in Eastern Europe at the end and after WW2 has ended. Many people, even in German-speaking countries, don't know that happened. Switzerland. We don't talk about Verdingkinder. It's basically child slavery as recently as 1960. You can't imagine the horror of poor Popal's children being sold to farmers for fieldwork. Getting abused, physical and sexual, in the richest country in the world. Yeah, we don't talk about that. There are no indigenous people in Tasmania. Also the fact that more indigenous kids get taken away from their families now than they did in the 60s. This is Australia-wide. In Romania we don't talk about the pre-WW1 and interwar peasant uprisings that have been violently put down. Everybody gives the image of a perfect Romanian state and society in this time. But many forget that in our independence war we had more frontline deaths from diseases that should have been relatively easy for us to treat at that time than from enemy gunfire. Not to mention the 1907 peasant uprisings. Also the Second World War and the politics in our country at the time. Edit. At 1.2k upvotes I find myself reading comments stating the same thing about their countries. I guess nobody wants to remember the specifics of WW2 just like you don't want to remember the specifics of that one-night stand where you drank too much and can't be bothered to remember. Polish people who collaborated with Nazi Germany and Soviet Union during World War II. Communist purge in Indonesia. In order to combat communism, the government permit extrajudicial killings and arrests without trial in the 60s. Millions of people died and the family members who survived cannot vote. Cannot work for the government and outcasted until 1998. For decades even when the ruling government then is no longer in power. Those family members did not receive any justice because talking about the victims is talking about communism and talking about communism is bad. Edit. Yes. The act of killing was one of the most famous piece of work that bring this event to light. Of course, it received quite a lot of controversy when it was released decades even after the regime has ended. Winston Churchill creating the Bengal famine. British Raj in all its glory. America apparently led an insurrection in the Philippines. America became involved in the war that was led by the Filipinos against Spain to gain control of the Philippines. When eventually Spain and America got in cahoots and orchestrated a whole battle to make it look like America won. Spain actually got paid off and gave them the land. Also how the US went on some self-righteous "we gotta help those savages" campaign of colonizing the Philippines along with other countries. Mark Twain even wrote criticisms against it. Never learned about it in the public school system. Gandhi was racist to Africans at least in his young adult days. Used to sleep naked with his niece and apparently he didn't treat the women around him well. I have no respect for him after I learned all of this. And for anyone making judgments about me, I don't have many issues with Nehru. Please post details. Many of you are posting as if we know the location that you are in. There are so many places in the world that you could be referring to. So many atrocities. Germany's colonial history. We are way too busy working through WW2 in history class to talk about that at length too. So most people have kind of forgotten about it. I had to explain to another Russian what a gulag was. Imagine if you mentioned Auschwitz to a German and they had no idea what you were talking about. It was never part of the school curriculum and as far as I know only one has been preserved as a museum in the middle of nowhere. Well, it gotta be the distribution of crack by the CIA in black neighborhoods to destabilize them. That was pretty fucked up. Probably the White Australia policy. Which was to, as the name suggests, make Australia a place where only woke people can live and be. It was mainly brought in to stop the Chinese from stealing all our gold during the gold rush, I believe. It was introduced around 1901. And wasn't stopped till about 1970, I am led to believe. We acknowledge that it was a horrible thing that happened. But no one talks about it. We don't talk about the events of Black September in Jordan. Palestinian Fedayins tried overthrowing the kingdom. The army retaliates and shells the refugee camps where the Fedayins were established. They were eventually expelled. It's seen as a moment where a brother lifted his rifle against his own brethren. And a spark of racism between Transjordanians and Palestinian refugees. Edit. It's an event both Jordanians and Palestinians don't like talking about. So it's more complex than one side being guilty. In Indonesia we did not talk about the massacre of the leftover of the Dutch after the Netherlands colonial government got out of Indonesia. Context. In 1942. The Netherlands government got out of Indonesia because they were defeated by the Japanese in the Asia-Pacific WW2. The vacuum of power created by the Netherlands caused confusion among local politicians and their masses. Short story. Before Japan came in to replace the Netherlands and restore order, all kinds of atrocities happened to the colonial family that had been left in Indonesia. They got raped, killed, tortured, beheaded, looted, you name it. This happened because the oppressed local people took revenge to the white people who used to be their masters, who treated them like slaves for years, even centuries. Problem is, this act of revenge did not care who got it. Children, old people, women, full-blood Dutch or mixed Dutch, their servants, or anyone working with them were treated the same. Almost all information about these events were non-existent in Indonesia's history. You only knew this story from those who lucky enough to escape it. German here. World War II kind of takes away from the fucked up things we also did in Africa before that. My Lai Massacre. The My Lai Massacre was the mass murder of unarmed Vietnamese civilians by United States troops on 16 March 1968 during the Vietnam War. Between 347 and 504 unarmed people were killed. Victims included men, women, children, and infants. In Croatia, people don't like to talk too much about Croatia's involvement with Nazism because it was too recent. And because the Croatian Nazis were never the majority of Croats but the few that there were given power by Hitler. Yet people still to this day go around saying Croatian Nazi salutes and using Croatian Nazi flags, the Croatian flag as a red and white checkered crest. The flag the Nazis used started with a white checker instead of a red checker. And because of the recent Croatian War of Independence, Croatian patriotism during the war somehow got mixed up with outdated Croatian Nazism, and now it's this weird thing nobody really wants to talk about, and you got kids as young as 15 saying shit like Za dom spremni, which is an old Nazi salute. Ireland sending condolences to Hitler. Congo. Specifically how it relates to the current wealth of the royal household. Collaboration in the Second World War. And how lots of post-war politicians got a chance to clean up their image. None of these things are not talked about in the strict sense. But there are persistent myths that keep cropping up. In Switzerland, we don't talk about our salary. Portugal. Teaching in school that we were the good colonizers, not cruel at all like the Spanish. Erasing all the massacres on African colonies, current president even said he wouldn't apologize for them. The fact that we only entered World War I to protect said colonies and not because we were allies. The fact that we were neutral in World War II when in fact we were deporting Jews to camps. I learned absolutely nothing in school about the Srebrenica genocide. My country had a peacekeeping force stationed there to protect Bosniaks from the Serb army. The Dutch battalion was under-equipped and therefore couldn't stop the genocide. In fact, they kind of stood by and watched it unfold. This is a really black page in modern Dutch history. It's not taught in school though. Which is why I decided to visit Srebrenica myself last year. Edit. Thank you all for your comments. I'll respond to some things I commonly found in some replies. There were some comments about me stating that Dutchbat just stood there. For the record, I don't doubt the good intentions of Dutchbat. They were outnumbered, had too little equipment, weak allies, and these soldiers now live with traumas too. I all recognize that and I respect the Dutch soldiers stationed there. Some people suggest that Srebrenica is not that much of a taboo in the Netherlands. Which is true when speaking about Serb atrocities. But judging our own role and responsibilities still feels sensitive sometimes in my opinion. There's some indication that high schools do in fact teach about Srebrenica. I applaud that. But at the same time I believe it's still a minority of high schools. As 2020 research suggests. How ass-backwards Reconstruction was after the Civil War. And apparently we don't talk about why the Civil War started. Because an absolute metric shit ton of Americans tried to claim states' rights. Or call it the War of Northern Aggression. Except the Vice President of the Confederacy laid out the reasons in his cornerstone speech. Made it abundantly clear that it was about slavery. The Confederate Constitution specifically spelled out protection of slavery, as did each individual state's constitution. The letters of secession drafted by each state explicitly said slavery was the primary cause. And as far as northern aggression, the The South fired the first shots of the war at featuring Sumter. Emu War. From my perspective, I would say that in Norway we don't talk much. Or enough anyway. About how Anders Breivik was one of us. Ever since he killed all those people in 2011, it's like most people just want to forget that it happened and that he exists. And there definitely hasn't been much of a public debate about how he was a product of our culture. I think we take such pride in being a progressive and peaceful country that he's almost a threat to our national identity. Also, the 400 years we were under Danish rule tend to not be talked about much in school, etc. World Cup Finals. I'm Dutch. Nazi gold. Guess where I am from? Indigenous Australians make up 3% of our population and 30% of prisoners. Fucked. CIA starting the crack epidemic in the US. Brazil was the country that received most slaves in all American continents. From 1500 to 1900. More than 4.86 million people were kidnapped in Africa and brought here. The harrying of the North is never really spoken about in the UK, and while it is a lot older than some of the atrocities mentioned in here, I think it is still relevant. Most people seem to think that after the Battle of Hastings all of England just fell in line under the Normans and William the Bastard, but in reality there were a lot of holdouts that refused to accept him as king. One of the major ones being in the north of England. In the years 1069 and 1070 he led campaigns to get rid of the rebels, but he was never able to pin them down, so he resorted to a scorched earth tactic by burning down farms, villages and whole towns and murdering the entire populations of some of them. Overall the harrying killed between 100,000 to 150,000 people, many of whom because of starvation. And it is important to keep in mind that at this time the entire population of England was only 2 million. Some historians also refer to it as a genocide, but it's practically never mentioned in the UK. The Norman conquest basically stops getting taught at 1066 and the rest just gets ignored, despite causing long-lasting issues that resonate even to this day. The New York draft riots of 1863. Irish-American immigrants couldn't avoid conscription during the Civil War, while blacks weren't drafted for their own protection against slavery. It was over a year's pay to skip the draft, so only wealthy whites could escape it. The firefighters, being mostly Irish, set fire to businesses that fired Irish and hired blacks, willing to work for lower pay. They let the city burn for days, often setting fire to buildings with people in them. They even burned a daycare, but the children and caretakers all luckily escaped. After the riots, Irish community leadership met with businesses and pressured them into firing all black employees under threat of burning them down again. Business owners complied. After all black workers were replaced, the NY Irish community created unions, which forced the owners to increase pay. This single event prevented the accumulation of black wealth for multiple generations post-slavery. Since black workers weren't only discouraged from joining unions, but uninvited. Edit. Date. Australians, Brits never hear about the child migrant scheme. British parents having to give their children to orphanages temporarily during the war. And those children being shipped to Australia for a better life, only to be used as slaves. Then after a time told their parents had died in the war. Parents told the same. And never knowing their family is alive. A movie was made about the woman who figured it out, Oranges and Sunshine. Danish people are really quick to condemn the English for their history with slavery when we played a huge part in it. So while we do talk about a lot of things, it's not the genocide of the Herero and Nama people in Namibia. Germany genocided 70,080,000 of them in 1904 to 1908. First genocide of the 20th century. Killed 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama people. Needed around 110 years for Germany to call it a genocide and 115 years to pay some reparations. Not fair ones though. They are like breadcrumbs. Many people from the area where I grew up in the Netherlands happily joined the Nazis. One former employer was a total piece of shit. I once complained about it to my parents and my dad remarked, "Yeah. He's always been a dick." Did you know his dad fought for the Nazis on the Eastern Front? The internment of Japanese Americans during WW2. We acknowledge it happened, but don't really talk about it. The mass genocide of natives. In the UK, As a teenager in secondary school, you are never taught about the atrocities our own country committed during the British Empire's rule. Even files that documented these atrocities were systematically destroyed by the Foreign Office in the 1960s as to not embarrass Her Majesty's government. Switzerland took away children from gypsies and give them to Swiss white parents to erase them from history. I'd say residential schools. But we're finally actually talking about that now. So my answer will be the Chinese head tax. Canada has always had a hatred for Chinese people. Even though they built much of the railway that allowed us to place the border where it is today. Not only were Chinese workers mistreated by their employers, they were also frequently murdered by their white co-workers. Among other things, the head tax made it unreasonably difficult for the workers' families to come over to reunite, and the agreements signed often included indentured servitude. It was only abolished when they put in a new law that cut off almost all Chinese immigration. Because the tax didn't deter them enough. To date, less than 20 people have been repaid the tax. But Canada isn't racist at all. Nope. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like. If you would like to see more content like this in the future, subscribe and turn on notifications to be notified about future videos. Now check out one of these interesting videos.